why'd you start with data? There's a lot of concerns about artificial intelligence and what it might do. Why'd you start with data?
Well, it's interesting. It's a good question. Ken Chenault and I, my partner, the co-chair in this thing, got together a couple years ago and said the issue with AI is going to be responsible use. And how can you as an enterprise use it responsibly, because it can be transformational. This is before all the excitement of GPT-4 and all the things that have occurred now, right? And so we formed this consortium of now 26 companies. It's like Walmart, Nike, Pfizer, Humana, American Express, NFL, big guys, enterprise guys, right? And got together, and one of the key projects that they thought we should focus on was data. The first one was on bias in data and HR practices, which was somewhat straightforward compared to, let's say, quality of data on the internet. And they came up with a whole set of procedures that they implemented, processes, et cetera. And the most recent one that their teams worked on was the quality of the data. And then how do you responsibly use that data so you can build trust? Because a large enterprise, whether you're in consumer packaged goods or you're in finance or whatever it happens to be, you have to have a trusted relationship with the information that you're using to either attract customers or transfer funds or fraud, whatever it happens to be.
Is there some self-enforcing here, I wondered, as I read about this? For example, if I use some data that has this metadata attached to it that says, for example, there are privacy restrictions, or there are origins that are more questionable. Right. If I use those data and things go wrong, somebody could come in and say, wait a second, you knew that there were restrictions on it, you didn't obey.
Well, that's an excellent question. So we're assuming you're ethical. That's the assumption. Now, these companies, obviously, as you can imagine, the names that are part of this consortium, I don't worry about the leadership of those countries. It doesn't mean there won't be those issues. That means you need to have what I used to call in the old cyber days, you might recall, the carrot and the stick. Mm-hmm. I.e., the stick is if you don't comply with the standards associated with the proper cyber process and you have a major hack, then you're liable. But if you comply, the carrot is then you'll be giving some form of grace period to cure. I think it applies here. It's the same thing. But now the standard has to emerge, to be fair. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be complicated and take time. Regulation is on steroids, which is in many ways appropriate because it could drive quality. If it does drive quality and transparency, it's working. But the regulators, as you know, there'll be more in that than that. But from an enterprise perspective, that's the most important thing. But it's back to the same thing. Can it be self-policing in the sense that if you haven't given an accurate explanation and therefore something bad happens, well, you're liable for that.
On the flip side of that, data is an asset. It has value.
Yes.
So if people did adopt this and it worked, could data sets be more valuable than they might otherwise be if you didn't have the metadata attached?
Now you're getting into something that's extremely complicated because the answer is yes, but then how do you value the asset? We've done a lot of work on a balance sheet because a lot of these assets are data and software, and they're not tangibles like a building or equipment or a tool or whatever it happens to be. So in the economic modeling of these things, it's a little more complicated, but your point is absolutely correct intellectually, that it is an asset. It's an asset of the enterprise. It's also an asset of the individual. I mean, if you want to get into consumer, that is your data, that is your asset. And the fact how that data is being used, you should participate in its usage. I'd argue if it's an economic value, you should share in the economic value. Now that hasn't occurred as to yet, but I do think some of the solutions here is make it almost a commercial relationship between the user and the service provider, so that if they are using the data correctly and you've complied, that's fine, and you get some economic value, whatever that, it could be free services, whatever that happens to be.
How is this working, or do you anticipate it would work across borders? Because this is a global business,
yes,
as a part of it, particularly when you get into generative AI, it's global necessarily. Is your vision that this would apply across borders? And yes, let me say even to China.
Well, if you left China out, I'd say yes. Now we're going to get more complicated. Or any authoritarian government that uses the information for, we would view not as open democratic principles, right? That's a complicated. Let's just take the more straightforward world. Let's talk about, say, the West, right? A lot of these companies, as you know, operate around the world in all these places. So they will implement these approaches that they say they're going to adopt. Our hope is that we'll get more participation from companies outside the United States that will do the same thing. But where we began, there are a couple companies that have been involved that were non-domiciled in the U.S., but it's not a larger portion of the 26. It's a couple. So we really think that if these large, like a Walmart adopts, people around the world say, well, these guys don't know what they're doing, or Nike, all these companies that operate everywhere else, that we'll get up the adoption rate. That's our hope.